As we move into a use of a new kind of software, we are going to start talking more seriously about cartography. The next few content lectures, both for this assignment and the next project, will all really deal with cartographic principles. A lot of cartographic principles, though, have to be understood just by looking at maps and talking about them. So I'll do my best to introduce some of the principles here, give you a few opportunities to reflect on them, but we still may want to talk about them in more depth in class. So the first thing to ask yourself in making any map is, what do you want a map to actually show? A map has to have a thesis, much like an essay does. You should be making a compelling reason for having the map and making the map and in the symbology that you're using. As with an essay, you don't want to get overly complicated or convoluted in your arguments. You want to be as simple and as effective as possible. One of the ways that you're going to do this is by using what's called visual hierarchy, making sure that the eye is drawn immediately to the most important things, whatever they might be, and work their way down from there. A little bit later, I'll talk more in another lecture about how the eye works in looking at a map, but some of the basic principles we'll put into play now. A map should also be aesthetically pleasing. The placement of objects should look right, the colors should be good, the symbols should be easy to read and understandable, and there should be typeface that's easy to read as well. Let's look at a couple of maps. This is a map that shows the oldest continuously functioning universities in Europe. It's super easy to know what this map is because the title is clear and our eye is immediately pulled to it. We can get a sense by looking quickly at the legend that oldest colors are in darker colors, and then the map uses a ramp that pretty obviously helps to point this out. Now this map does have a lot of text in it and on it, and it has a lot of very small symbols that we'd have to dive deeply into if we were trying to understand this map. Remember that that's an important thing about a map. Some maps need to convey a point very quickly. Some are going to take some time. This map's going to take a little bit more time than what we immediately see. But nonetheless, it's a strong map, especially for someone who wants to look at a lot of details. This next map is not so good. It shows Europe versus the United States in sunshine duration in hours per year. We can barely see the title. The United States is oddly positioned with respect to Europe. The latitude and longitude, we have no idea what they are and whether they're accurate at all. We do get a good color ramp here that's aesthetically pleasing that helps us to understand the sunshine, but there's a lot that's missing here as well. This next map is a good map in some ways. It shows what is most consumed across European regions, but the title is problematic. What do you mean, what is most consumed? We have to dig down a little deeper to find out that we're talking here about edible oils, and that the colors represent a spectrum from olive oil to butter. I like the idea and the concept of the map, but the visual hierarchy doesn't work so well. The title isn't clear either. So the argument of the map starts to fall apart. I'll let you just take a look at this map on its own. You can look at it, consider it, and decide if you think that it's doing a good job or not. And then this final map here is a more technical map that shows the number of live births per woman or the total fertility rate in 2019. Again, the legend is easy to read, the visual hierarchy seems strong, and it's easy to get a sense of patterns by looking at the map. It has little inset maps so that we can see very small countries and what their rates are. That's a useful thing, and we'll talk more about that, not in this project, but in the next one. So obviously in these maps, color was very important. Color can be used in all sorts of different ways, and we will dive into color a little bit more and talk about it more. It's used in point and line symbology, usually relatively simplistically, but in what are called choropleth maps or aerial maps that use color, color can be quite complicated, and the patterns of colors can be difficult not only to reproduce in the map, but also to make them make sense as well. Going back to symbols a little bit and looking at color at the same time, this is a map that I made that I showed you before. Maybe you can find some ways to critique it now. I certainly can find ways that I would critique this map. It's relatively easy to understand what the map is. It's relatively easy to understand what the symbols are trying to tell us as well. And I think the color of red versus blue works because of the obvious political connotations of these two colors in the United States. Here's a map that I made showing ski trails in Kincaid. The color pattern uses trails that are green for novice, yellow that are intermediate, and red that are more advanced trails. Again, the hierarchy of the colors seems to work fairly well, and it picks up pretty well looking at the map too. Again, as with the last map, there's certainly some things I would do different if I were making this map again. One thing that's noteworthy on this map is that there are some different types of symbols, including little parking lot icons that show some point data, as well as some icons that show areas where there are steep downhills and lighted trails as well. This is a map that's a little bit hard to understand, but it's a mortality map. It's essentially a map that's showing us where you have higher rates of mortality in what's called health service area versus other health service areas in the United States. Once we know what the map is, it's relatively easy to understand. And as we take a look at the legend, it's fairly easy to figure out that the darker, browner colors are areas where we have higher rates of mortality, and the greener ones are where people are less likely to die. There is no clear title on this map, and that's something that I think is clearly missing on it. Another thing that I think is problematic, is I think you'll figure out too, is that both Alaska and Hawaii are placed oddly. The shapes don't look quite right, and they're not juxtaposed on the map particularly well either. One way you can learn more about color is to just go to Google and type in color brewer, and you'll go to this page right here, which is actually produced by a cartographer and shows a whole lot of different ways that color can be expressed on maps. Different what are called color ramps that show colors as they go from warmer to darker or from stronger to weaker colors, as well as different color patterns that can be used for qualitative data, for non-numerical data. And there's also color advice as well if you're interested in producing a map that works for people who are colorblind. I'd strongly recommend that you take a look at Color Brewer and that you experiment with it a little bit. It's a pretty neat site, and one that will be useful later on in the course as well. When we talked about symbols in the past, one of the things that we looked at was different types of symbols that showed either single, unique, proportional, or graduated points, or circles, or lines, or something like that. And you've already experimented a little bit with those in some of the very first maps that you made. But I wanted to come back to symbols again to say that there are all sorts of other types of so-called pictographic symbols. There's a huge range of different symbols out there that can be graduated or proportional, just like these other symbols can. These would include things like parking lot symbols, as we looked at before, or any number of different types of symbols that you may want to use on a map that you make. Just remember that the symbols should always be understandable in whatever context they're being used in. So in the case of a ski trail, a P for parking lot makes a lot of sense, but in other situations it might not. Make sure that the symbol makes sense in its context, and make sure it's easy to read as well. One of the problems with pictographic symbols can be that they tend to clutter a map very quickly. And if your map isn't made to be understood by deeply examining it, these pictograms can really begin to cause problems in a map. Some of the pictographic symbols that we're most familiar with include those that are shown on a topographic map. Now, a topographic map can be relatively cluttered and busy compared to some of the maps that we've looked at before. But remember, it's a map that's supposed to be studied. It's not trying to make just one very clear argument about something like fertility rates or mortality rates. Instead, it's something that needs to be interpreted over time as we try to make our way through a landscape. Here are a whole bunch of different symbols that, of course, show up on maps, and there are plenty more than this. Once you start getting into the software that you're using, you'll see that there is a large range of map symbols that you can use. Again, remember to use these symbols in ways that make a lot of sense, that are very clear and easy to read. And then the final map I have here is another pictographic one of the more famous ones, I think, for cartographers. It's a map that shows the landforms of the United States. And it was drawn by a cartographer who's sort of a, I guess like a hero figure to cartographers named Erwin Reutz. He used small little pictures of mountains and rivers and plateaus and other features to draw an incredibly accurate visual representation of the landforms of the United States. And it's just an example of some of the many different ways that maps can be produced. In this course, we focus mostly on computer cartography, but of course there's a world of cool hand-drawn maps out there as well. So this is a first introduction to cartography and colors and symbols and a bunch of things that we've already touched on a little bit before. We're going to keep on digging into this, but remember, a lot of this is going to require you to look at maps, think about maps, and really to build up a map sense that you might not really have tapped into yet.